Okay, good morning. See, we've got one person in there so far. So like last time, we will wait about 5 minutes. Okay, I'll give everybody 5 minutes to get organized here. And remember, if you want to comment in the chat, you'll need to log into an account, okay? So if you aren't logged in, you won't be able to chat. Hi, Ronan. I see we got 3 of us in there now. So reminders, if you are logged in with your student account, so your student number and that email, your student number at students.sd63, you will not be able to comment in the chat. It's just a district restriction. So you'll need to log in either with your own personal Google account or a parent account. Okay. So we'll give people a couple more minutes to get themselves organized. I think last time we had about 17 people in here, which was awesome. So I'm hoping that we'll have about the same today. Oh, I can see another one. And I hope this is easy enough for everybody to find. Oh, we're up to 8 now. Perfect. That's great. Oh, and Joshua's here. And is that Reed? Is Reed in here too? I think that might have been Reed. We're up to 8. Awesome. Okay. A few more minutes. And while we're waiting, maybe what we'll do is just go over what happened in chapters 1 and 2. So remember, chapter 1, it started off with Harry's birthday again. So he's back at the Dursleys. It's on summer break from Hogwarts. And so he had a pretty rough birthday again, just like in the first book. And then chapter 2, we meet Dobby, the house elf. So he came to give Harry a warning that something bad was going to happen if Harry returned to Hogwarts, right? So, so what else? Oh, and then we left off. Oh, hi, Dakota. I see that you're in there too. And Milo's in here too. That's awesome. So we've got Ronan, Reed, Joshua, Dakota, and Milo so far in our chat, which is so great. And reminders, just like last time, if you have a question about the book, once we get started, you can ask that in the chat. But if you have other questions or you just want to chat with classmates, and Bridget's in here too. Save that for the end of the read aloud, and then we can have a little bit of a chat after, okay? Just like we did last time, okay? So questions about the book for now, or once we get started, and then we can have a bit more of a question time after, okay? So we left off chapter 2. Do you guys remember who was outside Harry's window? Oh, Bridget, you're eating popcorn. Yum. I still have my coffee. I've got a different mug today. Oh, and Douglas is in here too. Perfect. So we left. So chapter 2 finished with Ron being outside Harry's window. Oh, I see power went out last night out in Sydney. That's crazy. My power stayed on last night, but I'm downtown Victoria, so it's a little bit different. Yeah, Reed, you're right. Ron was outside Harry's window. So we are going to get started here pretty quick. So we're up to 10 people that are watching, which is awesome. Maybe we'll get some more as we go. And I hope everybody got my email about, maybe not everybody got my email about the time change. It just with, I I had some meetings this morning, and I have some meetings this afternoon, so I wasn't able to get started at 11:45 today. So, and I see Mila's in there too. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to get started. So we are on chapter 3, the burrow. Ron, breathed Harry, creeping to the window and pushing it up so they could talk through the bars. Ron, what the? Harry's mouth fell open as the full impact of what he was seeing hit him. Ron was leaning out of the back window of an old turquoise car which was parked in mid-air. Grinning at Harry from the front seats were Fred and George, Ron's elder twin brothers. All right, Harry? What's been going on? Said Ron. Why haven't you been answering my letters? I've asked you to stay about 12 times, and then Dad came home and said you'd got an official warning for using magic in front of muggles. It wasn't me. And how did he know? He works for the ministry, said Ron. You know we're not supposed to do spells outside school. Bit rich coming from you, said Harry, staring at the floating car. Oh, this doesn't count, said Ron. We're only borrowing this. It's Dad's. We didn't enchant it. But doing magic in front of those muggles you live with. I told you I didn't, but it'll take too long to explain now. Look, can you explain to them at Hogwarts that the Dursleys have locked me up and won't let me come back? And obviously I can't magic myself out because the ministry will think that's the second spell I've done in 3 days. So stop gibbering, said Ron. We've come to take you home with us. But you can't magic me out either. We don't need to, said Ron, jerking his head towards the front seats and grinning. You forget who I've got with me. Tie that round the bars, said Fred, throwing the end of a rope to Harry. If the Dursleys wake up, I'm dead, said Harry as he tied the rope tightly around a bar and Fred revved up the car. Don't worry, said Fred, and stand back. Harry moved back into the shadows next to Hedwig, who seemed to have realized how important this was and kept still and silent. The car revved louder and louder, and suddenly, with a crunching noise, the bars were pulled clean out of the window as Fred drove straight up in the air. Harry ran back to the window to see the bars dangling a few feet above the ground. Panting, Ron hoisted them up into the car. Harry listened anxiously, but there was no sound from the Dursleys' bedroom. When the bars were safely in the back seat with Ron, Fred reversed as close as possible to Harry's window. Get in, Ron said. But all my Hogwarts stuff, my wand, my broomstick. Where is it? Locked in the cupboard under the stairs, and I can't get out of this room. No problem, said George from the front passenger seat. Out of the way, Harry. Fred and George climbed carefully through the window into Harry's room. You had to hand it to them, thought Harry, as George took an ordinary hairpin from his pocket and started to pick the lock. A lot of wizards think it's a waste of time knowing this sort of muggle trick, said Fred, but we feel their skills worth learning, even if they're a bit slow. There was a small click and the door swung open. So, we'll get your trunk. You grab anything you need from your room and hand it out to Ron, whispered George. Watch out for the bottom stair. It creaks, Harry whispered back as the twins disappeared onto the dark landing. Harry dashed around his room, collecting his things together and passing them out of the window to Ron. Then he went to help Fred and George heave his trunk up the stairs. Harry heard Uncle Vernon cough. At last, panting, they reached the landing, then carried the trunk through Harry's room to the open window. Fred climbed back into the car to pull with Ron, and Harry and George pushed from the bedroom side. Inch by inch, the trunk slid through the window. Uncle Vernon coughed again. A bit more, panted Fred, who was pulling from inside the car. One good push. Harry and George threw their shoulders against the trunk, and it slid out of the window into the back seat of the car. Okay, let's go, George whispered. But as Harry climbed onto the windowsill, there came a sudden loud screech from behind him, followed immediately by the thunder of Uncle Vernon's voice. That ruddy owl! I've forgotten Hedwig. Harry tore back across the room as the landing light clicked on. He snatched up Hedwig's cage, dashed to the window, and passed it out to Ron. He was scrambling back onto the chest of drawers when Uncle Vernon hammered on the unlocked door, and it crashed open. For a split second, Uncle Vernon stood framed in the doorway. Then he let out a bellow like an angry bull and dived at Harry, grabbing him by the ankle. Ron, Fred, and George seized Harry's arms and pulled as hard as they could. "Petunia!" roared Uncle Vernon. "He's getting away! He's getting away!" The Weasleys gave a gigantic tug, and Harry's legs slid out of Uncle Vernon's grasp. As soon as Harry was in the car and had slammed the door shut, Ron yelled, "Put your foot down, Fred!" And the car shot suddenly towards the moon. Harry couldn't believe it. He was free. He wound down the window, the night air whipping his hair, and looked back at the shrinking rooftops of Privet Drive. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and Dudley were all hanging, dumbstruck, out of Harry's window. "See you next summer," Harry yelled. See, we've got about 9 people. I'm wondering if people maybe didn't get my email, which is okay. Because we're going to keep doing our read alouds every day now, okay, instead of just Thursdays. I think I said that in my email, but every day it'll be at 11 o'clock, okay, just for you guys, if you can remember, okay? "See you next summer," Harry yelled. The Weasleys roared with laughter, and Harry settled back in his seat, grinning from ear to ear. "Let Hedwig out," he told Ron. "She can fly behind us. She hasn't had a chance to stretch her wings for ages." George handed the hairpin to Ron, and a moment later, Hedwig had soared joyfully out of the window to glide alongside them like a ghost. "So, what's the story, Harry?" said Ron impatiently. "What's been happening?" Harry told them all about Dobby, the warning he'd given Harry, and the fiasco of the violet pudding. There was a long, shocked silence when he had finished. "Very fishy," said Fred finally. "Definitely dodgy," agreed George. "So he wouldn't even tell you who's supposed to be plotting all this stuff?" "I don't think he could," said Harry. "I told you, every time he got close to letting something slip, he started banging his head against the wall." He saw Fred and George look at each other. "What, you think he was lying to me?" said Harry. "Well," said Fred, "put it this way. House elves have got powerful magic of their own, but they can't usually use it without their master's permission. I reckon old Dobby was sent to stop you coming back to Hogwarts. Someone's idea of a joke. Can you think of anyone at school with a grudge against you?" "Yes," said Harry and Ron together instantly. "Draco Malfoy," Harry explained. "He hates me." "Draco Malfoy?" said George, turning around. "Not Lucius Malfoy's son?" Or is it Lucius? You guys know that I'm not great at pronouncing all the Harry Potter names. I think it's Lucius. "Must be. It's not a very common name, is it?" said Harry. "Why?" "I've heard Dad talking about him," said George. "He was a big supporter of you-know-who." "And when you-know-who disappeared," said Fred, craning around to look at Harry, "Lucius Malfoy came back saying he never meant any of it. Load of dung. Dad reckons he was right in you-know-who's inner circle." Harry had heard these rumors about Malfoy's family before, and they didn't surprise him at all. Malfoy made Dudley Dursley look like a kind, thoughtful, and sensitive boy. "I don't know whether the Malfoys own a house elf," said Harry. "Well, whoever owns him will be an old wizarding family, and they'll be rich," said Fred. "Yeah, Mum's always wishing we had a house elf to do the ironing," said George. "But all we've got is a lousy old ghoul in the attic and gnomes all over the garden. House elves come with big old manors and castles and places like that. You wouldn't catch one in our house." Okay, so I'm seeing lots of chit chat in our comment section here. So remember, trying to keep that till the end, okay? So if you have questions about the book, you can ask them in the chat, but it's not a place to just have a conversation right now, okay? Just like when we're doing our read aloud in our class. Thank you. Harry was silent. Judging by the fact that Draco Malfoy usually had the best of everything, his family were rolling in wizard gold, he could just see Malfoy strutting around a large manor house. Sending the family servant to stop Harry going back to Hogwarts also sounded exactly like the sort of thing Malfoy would do. Had Harry been stupid to take Dobby seriously? I know you guys are bored. I know it's hard to stay busy right now, right? But we got to do what we can, okay? Had Harry been stupid to take Dobby seriously? I'm glad we came to get you anyway, said Ron. I was getting really worried when you didn't answer any of my letters. I thought it was Errol's fault at first. Who's Errol? Our owl. He's ancient. It wouldn't be the first time he'd collapsed on a delivery. So then I tried to borrow Hermes. Who? The owl Mum and Dad bought Percy when he was made a prefect, said Fred from the front. But Percy wouldn't lend him to me, said Ron. Said he needed him. Percy's been acting very oddly this summer, said George, frowning, and he has been sending a lot of letters and spending a load of time shut up in his room. I mean, there's only so many times you can polish a prefect badge. You're driving too far west, Fred, he added, pointing at a compass on the dashboard. Fred twiddled the steering wheel. So, does your dad know you've got the car? Said Harry, guessing the answer. Nope, Ron is with Fred and George. So Fred and George are in the front seat, and Ron and Harry are in the back, and they are driving back to the Weasleys' house. So they picked up Harry from the Dursleys, and they are driving back. But remember, they're driving their cars up in the air, right? So it's a bewitched car, an enchanted car. No, said Ron. He had to work tonight. Hopefully we'll be able to get it back in the garage without Mum noticing we flew it. What does your dad do at the Ministry of Magic anyway? He works in the most boring department, said Ron. The misuse of Muggle artifacts office. The what? It's all to do with bewitching things that are Muggle made, in case they end up back in a Muggle shop or house. Like last year, some old witch died and her tea set was sold to an antique shop. This Muggle woman bought it, took it home, and tried to serve her friends tea in it. It was a nightmare. Dad was working overtime for weeks. What happened? The teapot went berserk and squirted boiling tea all over the place, and one man ended up in the hospital with the sugar tongs clamped to his nose. Dad was going frantic. It's only him and an old warlock called Perkins in the office, and they had to do memory charms and all sorts to cover it up. But your dad, this car, Fred laughed. Yeah, Dad's mad about everything to do with Muggles. Our shed's full of Muggle stuff. He takes it apart, puts spells on it, and puts it back together again. If he raided our house, he'd have to put himself straight under arrest. It drives Mum mad. That's the main road, said George, peering down through the windscreen, which is like the windshield. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Just as well. It's getting light. A faint pinkish glow was visible along the horizon to the east. Fred brought the car lower, and Harry saw a dark patchwork of fields and clumps of trees. We're a little way outside the village, said George. Ottery Street catchpole. Lower and lower went the flying car. The edge of a brilliant red sun was now gleaming through the trees. Touchdown, said Fred as, with a slight bump, they hit the ground. They had landed next to a tumble-down garage in a small yard, and Harry looked out for the first time at Ron's house. It looked as though it had once been a large stone pigsty, but extra rooms had been added here and there until it was several stories high and so crooked it looked as though it was held up by magic, which, Harry reminded himself, it probably was. 4 or 5 chimneys were perched on top of the red roof. A lopsided sign stuck in the ground near the entrance read The Burrow. Round the front door lay a jumble of Wellington boots and a very rusty cauldron. Several fat brown chickens were pecking their way around the yard. It's not much, said Ron. It's brilliant, said Harry happily, thinking of Privet Drive. They got out of the car. Now, we'll go upstairs really quietly, said Fred, and wait for Mum to call us for breakfast. Then, Ron, you come bounding downstairs going, Mum, look who turned up in the night. And she'll be all pleased to see Harry, and no one need ever know we flew the car, said Ron. Come on, Harry, I sleep at the... Ron had gone a nasty greenish color, his eyes fixed on the house. The other 3 wheeled around. Mrs. Weasley was marching across the yard, scattering chickens, and for a short, plump, kind-faced woman, it was remarkable how much she looked like a saber-toothed tiger. Ah, said Fred. Oh dear, said George. Mrs. Weasley came to a halt in front of them, her hands on her hips, staring from one guilty face to the next. She was wearing a flowered apron with a wand sticking out of the pocket. So, she said. Morning, Mum, said George in what he clearly thought was a jaunty, winning voice. Have you any idea how worried I've been? Said Mrs. Weasley in a deadly whisper. Sorry, Mum, but see, we do. All three of Mrs. Weasley's sons were taller than she was, but they cowered as her rage broke over them. Yeah, so Fred and George are Ron's brothers, right? So they're twins, and Ron has other older brothers too, right? He's got Percy and Charlie, I think, is one of them, but Charlie is living somewhere else, right? He works with dragons. I think we learned that in the first book, right? But they cowered as her rage broke over them. Bed's empty, no note, car gone, could have crashed, out of my mind with worry. Did you care? Never. As long as I've lived, you wait until your father gets home. We never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or Percy. Perfect, Percy, muttered Fred. You could do with taking a leaf out of Percy's book, yelled Mrs. Weasley, prodding a finger in Fred's chest. You could have died. You could have been seen. You could have lost your father his job. It seemed to go on for hours. Mrs. Weasley had shouted herself hoarse before she turned on Harry, who backed away. I'm very pleased to see you, Harry dear, she said. Come in and have some breakfast. She turned and walked back into the house, and Harry, after a nervous glance at Ron, who nodded encouragingly, followed her. The kitchen was small and rather cramped. There was a scrubbed wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Harry sat down at the edge of his seat, looking around. He had never been in a wizard house before. No, Ron wasn't talking. It was Mrs. Weasley was yelling, right? And now they are in the kitchen. The clock on the wall opposite him had only one hand and no numbers at all. Written around the edge were things like time to make tea, time to feed the chickens, and you're late. Books were stacked 3 deep on the mantelpiece, books with titles like Charm Your Own Cheese, Enchantment in Baking, and 1 Minute Feasts. It's magic. And unless Harry's ears were deceiving him, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching Hour with the popular singing sorceress Celestina Warbeck. Mrs. Weasley was clattering around, cooking breakfast a little haphazardly, throwing dirty looks at her sons as she threw sausages into the frying pan. Every now and then, she muttered things like, don't know what you were thinking of, and never would have believed it. I don't blame you, dear, she assured Harry, tipping 8 or 9 sausages onto his plate. Yeah, I think you're right, Milo. I think Charlie's the one that took the dragon. Or was it Bill? I can't remember. Bill or Charlie, one of them. Arthur and I have been worried about you too. Just last night we were saying we'd come and get you ourselves if you hadn't written back to Ron by Friday. But really, she was now adding 3 fried eggs to his plate. Flying an illegal car halfway across the country, anyone could have seen you. Was it Charlie? Did Charlie take the dragon? I think you have a better memory than I do. Yeah, because if you guys are trying to remember, Hagrid had the dragon egg, right? And we learned that in the first book. So, and then they needed to pass it on to somebody else. And Charlie, Ron's brother, Charlie took it. Right. Okay. Thank you. She flicked her wand casually at the washing up in the sink, which began to clean itself, clinking gently in the background. It was cloudy, Mum, said Fred. You keep your mouth closed while you're eating, Mrs. Weasley snapped. They were starving him, Mum, said George. And you, said Mrs. Weasley, but it was with a slightly softened expression that she started cutting Harry bread and buttering it for him. At that moment, there was a diversion in the form of a small red-headed figure in a long nightdress who appeared in the kitchen, gave a small squeal, and ran out again. Ginny, said Ron in an undertone to Harry, my sister. She's been talking about you all summer. Yeah, she'll be wanting your autograph, Harry, grinned George. Winnie's listening to Bridget? Good. She'll be wanting your autograph, Harry, grinned Fred, but he caught his mother's eye and bent his face over his plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 4 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly short time. Blimey, I'm tired, yawned Fred, setting down his knife and fork at last. I think I'll go to bed and— You will not, snapped Mrs. Weasley. It's your own fault you've been up all night. You're going to denome the garden for me. They're getting completely out of hand again. Oh, Mom. And you two, she said, glaring at Ron and Fred. You can go up to bed, dear, she added to Harry. So George, Ron, and Fred have to go out into the garden, and Harry can go up to bed. You didn't ask them to fly that wretched car. But Harry, who felt wide awake, said quickly, I'll help Ron. I've never seen a denoming. That's very sweet of you, dear, but it's dull work, said Mrs. Weasley. Now, let's see what Lockhart's got to say on the subject. And she pulled a heavy book from the stack on the mantelpiece. George groaned. Mom, we know how to denome a garden. Harry looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words, Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests. There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. Oh, he is marvelous, she said. He knows his household pests, all right. It's a wonderful book. Mum fancies him, said Fred in a very audible whisper. Don't be so ridiculous, Fred, said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get on with it, and woe betide you if there's a single gnome in that garden when I come out to inspect it. Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Harry behind them. The garden was large and, in Harry's eyes, exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys wouldn't have liked it, but there were plenty of weeds, and the grass needed cutting. But there were gnarled trees all around the walls, plants Harry had never seen, spilling from every flower bed, and a big green pond full of frogs. Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know, Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. Yeah, I've seen those things they think are gnomes, said Ron, bent double with his head in a peony bush. Like fat little Father Christmases with fishing rods. There was a violent scuffling noise. The peony bush shuddered, and Ron straightened up. This is a gnome, he said grimly. Get off me, squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Father Christmas. It was small and leathery looking, with a large, knobbly bald head, exactly like a potato. Ron held it at arm's length as it kicked out at him with its horny little feet. He grasped it around the ankles and turned it upside down. This is what you have to do, he said. He raised the gnome above his head. Get off me, and started to swing it in great circles like a lasso. Seeing the shocked look on Harry's face, Ron added, It doesn't hurt them. You just got to make them really dizzy so they can't find their way back to the gnome holes. He let go of the gnome's ankles. It flew 20 feet into the air and landed with a thud in the field over the hedge. Pitiful, said Fred. I bet I can get mine beyond that stump. Harry learned quickly not to feel too sorry for the gnomes. He decided just to drop the first one he caught over the hedge, but the gnome, sensing weakness, sank its razor-sharp teeth into Harry's finger, and he had a hard job shaking it off. Until, wow, Harry, that must have been 50 feet. The air was soon thick with flying gnomes. See, they're not too bright, said George, seizing 5 or 6 gnomes at once. The moment they know the denoming's going on, they storm up to have a look. Ronan, we are on chapter 3 still. And we'll do 2 chapters. So we'll do chapter 3 and 4 today. They storm up to have a look. You'd think they'd have learned by now to just stay put. Soon, the crowd of gnomes in the field started walking away in a straggling line, their little shoulders hunched. They'll be back, said Ron, as they watched the gnomes disappear into the hedge on the other side of the field. They love it here. Dad's too soft with them. He thinks they're funny. Just then, the front door slammed. He's back, said George. Dad's home. They hurried through the garden and back into the house. Mr. Weasley was slumped in a kitchen chair with his glasses off and his eyes closed. He was a thin man, going bald, but the little hair he had was as red as any of his children's. I don't know how many chapters there are, my friend. we can take a look after we finish, okay? He was wearing long green robes which were dusty and travel-worn. What a night, he mumbled, groping for the teapot as they all sat down around him. 9 raids, 9. And old Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on me when I had my back turned. Mr. Weasley took a long gulp of tea and sighed. Anything, Dad? Said Fred eagerly. All I got were a few shrinking door keys and a biting kettle, yawned Mr. Weasley. There was some pretty nasty stuff that wasn't my department, though. Mortlake was taken away for questioning about some extremely odd ferrets, but that's the Committee on Experimental Charms, thank goodness. Why would anyone bother making door keys shrink, said George. Just muggle baiting, sighed Mr. Weasley. Sell them a key that keeps shrinking to nothing so they can never find it when they need it. Of course, it's very hard to convict anyone because no muggle would admit their key keeps shrinking. They'll insist they just keep losing it. Bless them. They'll go to any lengths to ignore magic, even if it's staring them in the face. But the things our lot have taken to enchanting, you wouldn't believe. Like cars, for instance. Mrs. Weasley had appeared, holding a long poker like a sword. Mr. Weasley's eyes jerked open. He stared guiltily at his wife. Cars, Molly dear? Yes, Arthur, cars, said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes flashing. Imagine a wizard buying a rusty old car and telling his wife all he wanted to do with it was take it apart to see how it worked. While really, he was enchanting it to make it fly. Mr. Weasley blinked. Well, dear, I think you'll find that he would be quite within the law to do that, even if he maybe would have done better to tell his wife the truth. There's a loophole in the law, you'll find, as long as he wasn't intending to fly the car. The fact that the car could fly wouldn't... Arthur Weasley, you made sure there was a loophole when you wrote that law, shouted Mrs. Weasley, just so you could carry on tinkering with all that muggle rubbish in your shed. And for your information, Harry arrived this morning in the car you weren't intending to fly. Harry, said Mr. Weasley, blankly. Harry who? He looked around, saw Harry, and jumped. Good Lord, is it Harry Potter? Very pleased to meet you. Ron's told us so much about... Your sons flew that car to Harry's house and back last night, shouted Mrs. Weasley. What have you got to say about that, eh? Did you really? Said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Did it go all right? I mean, he faltered as sparks flew from Mrs. Weasley's eyes. That was very wrong, boys. Very wrong indeed. Let's leave them to it, Ron muttered to Harry as Mrs. Weasley swelled like a bullfrog. Come on, I'll show you my bedroom. They slipped out of the kitchen and down a narrow passageway to an uneven staircase, which zigzagged its way up through the house. On the third landing, a door stood ajar. Harry just caught sight of a pair of bright brown eyes staring at him before it closed with a snap. Ginny, said Ron, you don't know how weird it is. Ginny, said Ron. You don't know how weird it is for her to be this shy. She never shuts up normally. They climbed 2 more flights until they reached a door with peeling paint and a small plaque on it saying, Ronald's room. Harry stepped in, his head almost touching the sloping ceiling, and blinked. It was like walking into a furnace. Nearly everything in Ron's room seemed to be a violent shade of orange. The bedspread, the walls, even the ceiling. Then Harry realized that Ron had covered nearly every inch of the shabby wallpaper with posters of the same 7 witches and wizards, all wearing bright orange robes, carrying broomsticks, and waving energetically. Your Quidditch team? Said Harry. The Chudley Cannons, said Ron, pointing at the orange bedspread, which was emblazoned with 2 giant black C's and a speeding cannonball, 9th in the league. Ron's school spellbooks were stacked untidily in a corner next to a pile of comics which all seemed to feature the adventures of Martin Miggs, the Mad Muggle. Ron's magic wand was lying on top of a fish tank full of frog spawn on the windowsill next to his fat gray rat Scabbers, who was snoozing in a patch of sun. Harry stepped over a pack of self-shuffling playing cards on the floor and looked out of the tiny window. In the field far below, he could see a gang of gnomes sneaking one by one back through the Weasley's hedge. Then he turned to look at Ron, who was watching him almost nervously, as though waiting for his opinion. "It's a bit small," said Ron quickly. "Not like that room you had with the Muggles. And I'm right underneath the ghoul in the attic. He's always banging on the pipes and groaning." But Harry, grinning widely, said, "This is the best house I've ever been in." Ron's ears went pink. That's the end of chapter 3. And we will start. And like Mila said, we are going to do our read alouds every day now. Okay, not just Thursdays. So starting tomorrow, starting today. So we've got today, we've got tomorrow, and then we'll do all next week too. Okay. So we can get through these books, and I've got the third one, and then we'll find if we get through that one quickly too, then we've got the fourth one as well. And there's, I think there's seven Harry Potter books. I don't know if we'll get through all of them this year, but we will do what we can. Okay. All right. So chapter 4, at Flourish and Bolts. At Flourish and Blots. Life at the Burrow was as different as possible from life in Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered. The Weasleys' house burst with the strange and unexpected. Harry got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece, and it shouted, "Tuck your shirt in, Scruffy." The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found most unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everybody there seemed to like him. Yeah, I did hear that too, Milo. It might be going back in June. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, right? It's a possibility. The fact that everybody there seemed to like him. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state of his socks and tried to force him to eat 4th helpings at every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table so that he could bombard him with questions about life with Muggles. Asking him to explain how things like plugs and the postal service worked. I'm excited to be reading every day too, Dakota. I figured this would be a great way to kind of keep up our regular read aloud, right? As we were doing it every day at school, so we'll do it every day here. Fascinating, he would say, as Harry talked him through using a telephone. Ingenious, really. How many ways Muggles have found of getting along without magic. Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning about a week after he had arrived at the Burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered a room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like the setting sun. Pretending he hadn't noticed this, Harry sat down and took the toast Mrs. Weasley offered him. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron identical envelopes of yellowish parchment addressed in green ink. "Dumbledore already knows you're here, Harry. Doesn't miss a trick, that man. You two have got them too," he added as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pajamas. I miss you guys too. So it's fun to see all of you guys chatting in there. And it's really nice to have our Google Classroom, right? That's a good spot for us to all be able to chat. And I will be sending out our class contact list so that you guys can start to contact each other, okay? So that's coming hopefully tomorrow. All right. For a few minutes, there was silence as they all read their letters. Harry's told him to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on September the 1st. There was also a list of the new books he'd need for the coming year. Second-year students will require The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, by Miranda Goshawk. Break with a Banshee by Gilderoy Lockhart. Gadding with Ghouls by Gilderoy Lockhart. Holidays with Hags by Gilderoy Lockhart. Travels with Trolls by Gilderoy Lockhart. Voyages with Vampires by Gilderoy Lockhart, Wanderings with Werewolves by Gilderoy Lockhart, Year with the Yeti by Gilderoy Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all Lockhart's books too?" he said. "The new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher must be a fan. Bet it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eye and quickly busied himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Well, we'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things secondhand." "Oh, are you starting at Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother Percy walked in. He was already dressed, his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his knitted tank top. "Morning all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leapt up again almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molting gray feather duster. At least that was what Harry thought it was, until he saw that it was breathing. "Errol," said Ron, taking the limp owl from Percy and extracting a letter from under its wing. "Finally, he's got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying we were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol to a perch just inside the back door and tried to stand him on it, but Errol flopped straight off again, so Ron lay him on the draining board instead, muttering, "Pathetic." Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it out loud. "Dear Ron and Harry, if you're there, I hope everything went all right and that Harry is okay and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out, Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been really worried, and if Harry is all right, will you please let me know at once? But perhaps it would be better if you used a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your one off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course." "How can she be?" said Ron in horror. "We're on holiday. And we're going to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love from Hermione." "Well, that fits in nicely. We can go and get all your things then too," said Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. "What are you all up to today?" Harry, Ron, Fred, and George were planning to go up the hill to a small paddock the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from view of the village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there, as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they had escaped and flown away over the village. Instead, they threw apples for each other to catch. They took it in turns to ride Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulders. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he had said he was busy. Harry had only seen Percy at mealtime so far. He stayed shut in his room the rest of the time. "Wish I knew what he was up to," said Fred, frowning. "He's not himself. His exam results came the day before you did. 12 OWLs, and he hardly gloated at all. Ordinary wizarding levels," George explained, seeing Harry's puzzled look. "Bill got 12 too. If we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family. I don't think I could stand the shame." Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and the next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. Harry had never met either of them, but knew that Charlie was in Romania studying dragons and Bill in Egypt working for the Wizards' Bank, Gringotts. "Don't know how Mom and Dad are going to afford all our school stuff this year," said George after a while. 5 sets of Lockhart books, and Ginny needs robes and a wand and everything. Harry said nothing. So, Mila, Percy is one of the Weasley brothers. Okay, so he's the oldest one at home. He's I think maybe going into his last year at Hogwarts, I think, if I remember correctly. Harry said nothing. He felt a bit awkward. Stored in an underground vault at Gringotts in London was a small fortune that his parents had left him. Of course, it was only in the wizarding world that he had money. You couldn't use galleons, sickles, and nuts in muggle shops. He had never mentioned his Gringotts bank account to the Dursleys. He didn't think their horror of anything connected with magic stretched to a large pile of gold. Mrs. Weasley woke them all early the following Wednesday. After a quick half a dozen bacon sandwiches each, they pulled on their coats and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. "We're running low, Arthur," she sighed. "We'll have to buy some more today." "Ah, well, guess first. After you, Harry, dear." And she offered him the flower pot. Harry stared at them all, watching him. "What am I supposed to do?" he stammered. "He's never traveled by Floo powder," said Ron suddenly. "Sorry, Harry, I forgot." "Never?" said Mrs. Weasley. "But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year?" "I went on the underground." "Really?" said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Were there escapators? How exactly? "Not now, Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear, but goodness me, if you've never used it before." "He'll be all right, Mum," said Fred. "Harry, watch us first." He took a pinch of glittering powder out of the flower pot, stepped into the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right in, shouted, "Diagon Alley," and vanished. "You must speak clearly, dear," said Mrs. Weasley told Harry, as George dipped his hand into the flower pot. "And mind you get out at the right grate." "The right what?" said Harry nervously as the fire roared and whipped George out of sight too. "Well, there are an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from, you know, but as long as you've spoken clearly." "He'll be fine, Molly, don't fuss," said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to Floo powder too. "But dear, if he got lost, how would we ever explain to his aunt and uncle?" "They wouldn't mind," Harry reassured her. "Dudley would think it was a brilliant joke if I got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about that." "Well, all right, you go after Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now, when you get into the fire, say where you're going. And keep your elbows tucked in," Ron advised. "And your eyes shut," said Mrs. Weasley. "The soot—" "Don't fidget," said Ron, "or you might well fall out of the wrong fireplace." Okay, Bridget, we're just listening, right? Okay, so I'm seeing lots of emojis. I'm seeing lots of jokes and things like that. Okay, we're almost finished chapter 4, and then you guys can have a few minutes of question time or just some chit chat. Okay, save it for then, please. But don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George. Trying hard to bear all this in mind, Harry took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire felt like a warm breeze. He opened his mouth and immediately swallowed a lot of hot ash. Diagon Alley, he coughed. It felt as though he was being sucked down a giant plug hole. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his ears was deafening. He tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked it in tightly, still spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were slapping his face. Squinting through his glasses, he saw a blurred stream of fireplaces and snatched glimpses of rooms beyond. His bacon sandwiches were churning inside him. He closed his eyes again, wishing it would stop, and then he fell, face forward, onto cold stone and felt his glasses shatter. Dizzy and bruised, covered in soot, he got gingerly to his feet, holding his broken glasses up to his eyes. He was quite alone, but where he was, he had no idea. All he could tell was that he was standing in the stone fireplace of what looked like a large, dimly lit wizard shop, but nothing in here was ever likely to be on a Hogwarts school list. A glass case nearby held a withered hand on a cushion, a bloodstained pack of cards, and a staring glass eye. So we'll have to wait and see what's happening, Miley. He got out of a fireplace and he doesn't know where he is. He's by himself until he's looking around. He's trying to figure out where he is. Evil-looking masks leered down from the walls. An assortment of human bones lay upon the counter, and rusty, spiked instruments hung from the ceiling. Even worse, the dark, narrow street Harry could see through the dusty shop window was definitely not Diagon Alley. The sooner he got out of here, the better. Nose still stinging where it had hit the hearth, Harry made his way swiftly and silently towards the door. But before he'd got halfway towards it, two people appeared on the other side of the glass, and one of them was the very last person Harry wanted to meet when he was lost, covered in soot and wearing broken glasses. Draco Malfoy. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside it and pulled the doors to, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, a bell clanged and Malfoy stepped into the shop. The man who followed could only be his father. He had the same pale, pointed face and identical cold gray eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop, looking lazily at the items on display, and rang a bell on the counter before turning to his son and saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." "I said I would buy you a racing broom," his father, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What's the good of that if I'm not on the house team?" said Malfoy, looking sulky and bad-tempered. "Harry Potter got a Nimbus 2000 last year. Special permission from Dumbledore so he could play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous. Famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine a shelf full of skulls. "Everyone thinks he's so smart, wonderful Potter with his scar and his broomstick." "You have told me this at least a dozen times already," said Mr. Malfoy with a quelling look at his son. "And I would remind you that it is not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter. Not when most of our kind regard him as the hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin." A stooping man had appeared behind the counter, smoothing his greasy hair back from his face. "Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again," said Mr. Borgin, in a voice as oily as his hair. "Delighted. And young Master Malfoy, too, charmed. How may I be of assistance? I must show you, just in today, and very reasonably priced." "I'm not buying today, Mr. Borgin, but selling," said Mr. Malfoy. "Selling?" The smile faded slightly from Mr. Borgin's face. "You have heard, of course, that the Ministry is conducting more raids," said Mr. Malfoy, taking a roll of parchment from his inside pocket and unraveling it for Mr. Borgin to read. "I have a few items at home that might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call." Mr. Borgin fixed a pair of pince-nez to his nose and looked down the list. "The Ministry wouldn't presume to trouble you, sir, surely?" Mr. Malfoy's lip curled. "I have not been visited yet. The name Malfoy still commands a certain respect, yet the Ministry grows ever more meddlesome. There are rumors about a new Muggle Protection Act. No doubt that flea-bitten, Muggle-loving fool Arthur Weasley is behind it." Harry felt a hot surge of anger. "And, as you see, certain of these poisons might make it appear—" "I understand, sir, of course," said Mr. Borgin. "Let me see." "Can I have that?" interrupted Draco, pointing at the withered hand on its cushion. "Ah, the Hand of Glory," said Mr. Borgin, abandoning Mr. Malfoy's list and scurrying over to Draco. "Insert a candle and it gives light only to the holder. Best friend of thieves and plunderers. Your son has fine taste, sir." "I hope my son will amount to more than a thief or a plunderer, Borgin," said Mr. Malfoy coldly. And Mr. Borgin said quickly, "No offense, sir, no offense meant." "Though if his school marks don't pick up," said Mr. Malfoy, more coldly still, "that may indeed be all he is fit for." "It's not my fault," retorted Draco. "The teachers all have favorites. That Hermione Granger." "I would have thought you'd be ashamed that a girl of no wizard family beat you in every exam," snapped Mr. Malfoy. "Ha," said Harry under his breath, pleased to see Draco looking both abashed and angry. "It's the same all over," said Mr. Borgin in his oily voice. "Wizard blood is counting for less everywhere." "Not with me," said Mr. Malfoy, his long nostrils flaring. "No, sir, nor with me, sir," said Mr. Borgin with a deep bow. "In that case, perhaps we can return to my list," said Mr. Malfoy shortly. "I am in something of a hurry, Borgin. I have important business elsewhere today." They started to haggle. Harry watched nervously as Draco drew nearer and nearer to his hiding place, examining the objects for sale. He paused to examine a long coil of hangman's rope and to read, smirking, the card propped on a magnificent necklace of opals. "Caution, do not touch. Cursed. Has claimed the lives of 19 Muggle owners to date." Draco turned away and saw the cabinet right in front of him. He walked forward. He stretched out his hand for the handle. Done, said Mr. Malfoy at the counter. Come, Draco. Harry wiped his forehead on his sleeve as Draco turned away. Good day to you, Mr. Borgin. I'll expect you at the manor tomorrow to pick up the goods. The moment the door had closed, Mr. Borgin dropped his oily manner. Good day yourself, Mr. Malfoy. And if the stories are true, you haven't sold me half of what's hidden in your manor. Muttering darkly, Mr. Borgin disappeared into a back room. Harry waited for a minute in case he came back, then, quietly as he could, slipped out of the cabinet, past the glass cases, and out of the shop door. Clutching his broken glasses to his face, he stared around. He had emerged into a dingy alleyway that seemed to be made up entirely of shops devoted to the dark arts. The one he'd just left, Borgin and Burke's, looked like the largest, but opposite was a nasty window display of shrunken heads, and 2 doors down, a large cage was alive with gigantic black spiders. 2 shabby-looking wizards were watching him from the shadow of a doorway, muttering to each other. Feeling jumpy, Harry set off, trying to hold his glasses on straight, and hoping against hope he'd be able to find a way out of there. An old wooden street sign hanging over a shop selling poisonous candles told him he was in Knockturn Alley. This didn't help, as Harry had never heard of such a place. He supposed he hadn't spoken clearly enough through his mouthful of ashes back in the Weasley's fire. Trying to stay calm, he wondered what to do. Not lost, are you, my dear? Said a voice in his ear, making him jump. An aged witch stood in front of him, holding a tray of what looked horribly like whole human fingernails. She leered at him, showing mossy teeth. Harry backed away. I'm fine, thanks, he said. I'm just... Harry, what do you think you're doing down there? Harry's heart leapt. So did the witch. A load of fingernails cascaded down over her feet, and she cursed as the massive form of Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, came striding towards them, beetle-black eyes flashing over his great bristling beard. Hagrid, Harry croaked in relief. I was lost. Flu powder. Hagrid seized Harry by the scruff of the neck and pulled him away from the witch, knocking the tray right out of her hands. Her shrieks followed them all the way along the twisting alleyway, out into bright sunlight. Harry saw a familiar snow-white marble building in the distance, Gringotts Bank. Hagrid had steered him right into Diagon Alley. You're a mess, said Hagrid gruffly, brushing soot off Harry so forcefully he nearly knocked him into a barrel of dragon dung outside an apothecary. Skulking around Knockturn Alley. I don't know. Dodgy place, Harry. Don't want no one to see you down there. I realized that, said Harry, ducking as Hagrid made to brush him off again. I told you, I was lost. What were you doing down there anyway? I was looking for a flesh-eating slug repellent, growled Hagrid. They're ruining the school cabbages. You're not on your own. I'm staying with the Weasleys, but we got separated, Harry explained. I've got to go and find them. They set off together down the street. How come you never wrote back to me? Said Hagrid as Harry jogged alongside him. He had to take 3 steps to every stride of Hagrid's enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. Ruddy muggles, growled Hagrid. If I'd have known. Harry, over here. Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing at the top of the white flight of steps to Gringotts. She ran down to meet them, her bushy brown hair flying behind her. What happened to your glasses? Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you again. Are you coming into Gringotts, Harry? As soon as I found the Weasleys, said Harry. You won't have to wait long. You won't have long to wait, grinned Hagrid. Harry and Hermione looked around. Sprinting up the crowded street were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. Harry, Mr. Weasley panted. We hoped you'd only gone one grade too far. He mopped his glistening bald patch. Molly's frantic. She's coming now. Where did you come out? Ron asked. Knockturn Alley, said Hagrid grimly. Brilliant, said Fred and George together. We've never been allowed in, said Ron enviously. I should ruddy well think not, growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley now came galloping into view, her handbag swinging wildly in one hand, Ginny just clinging onto the other. Oh, Harry, oh, my dear, you could have been anywhere. Gasping for breath, she pulled a large clothes brush out of her bag and began sweeping off the soot Hagrid hadn't managed to beat away. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses, gave them a tap of his wand, and returned them, good as new. Well, gotta be off, said Hagrid, who was having his hand wrung by Mrs. Weasley. Knockturn Alley, if you hadn't found him, Hagrid. See you at Hogwarts. And he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed street. Guess who I saw in Borgin and Burke's? Harry asked Ron and Hermione as they climbed the Gringotts steps. Malfoy and his father. Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything? Said Mr. Weasley sharply behind them. No, he was selling. So he's worried, said Mr. Weasley with grim satisfaction. Oh, I'd love to get Lucius Malfoy for something. You be careful, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley sharply as they were ushered into the bank by a bowing goblin at the door. That family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew. So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy? Said Mr. Weasley indignantly. But he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. But you're muggles, said Mr. Weasley delightedly. We must have a drink. What's that you've got there? Oh, you're changing muggle money. Molly, look. He pointed excitedly at the 10-pound notes in Mr. Granger's hand. Meet you back here, Ron said to Hermione as the Weasleys and Harry were led off to their underground vaults by another Gringotts goblin. The vaults were reached by means of small, goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature train tracks through the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than he had in Knockturn Alley when it was opened. There was a very small pile of silver sickles inside, and just one gold galleon. Mr. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping the whole lot into her bag. Harry felt even worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view as he hastily shoved handfuls of coins into a leather bag. Back outside on the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had spotted their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Mrs. Weasley and Ginny were going to a second-hand robe shop. Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. We'll all meet at Flourish and Blott's in an hour to buy your schoolbook, said Mrs. Weasley, setting off with Ginny. And not one step down Knockturn Alley, she shouted at the twins retreating backs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione strolled off along the winding cobbled street. The bag of gold, silver, and bronze jangling cheerfully in Harry's pocket was clamoring to be spent. So he bought 3 large strawberry and peanut butter ice creams, which they slurped happily as they wandered up the alley, examining the fascinating shop windows. Ron gazed longingly at a full set of Chudley Cannon robes in the windows of quality Quidditch supplies until Hermione dragged them off to buy ink and parchment next door. In Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke Shop, they met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's fabulous wet start no-heat fireworks. And in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, wonky brass scales, and old cloaks covered in potion stains, they found Percy, deeply immersed in a small and deeply boring book called Prefects Who Gained Power. A study of Hogwarts prefects and their later careers, Ron read aloud off the back cover. That sounds fascinating. Go away, Percy snapped. Of course, he's very ambitious. Percy's got it all. He's got it all planned out. He wants to be Minister of Magic, Ron told Harry and Hermione in an undertone as they left Percy to it. An hour later, they headed for Flourish and Blott's. They were by no means the only ones making their way to the bookshop. As they approached it, they saw, to their surprise, a large crowd jostling outside the doors, trying to get in. The reason for this was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper windows. Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography, Magical Me, today, 12:30 to 4:30 p.m. We can actually meet him, Hermione squealed. I mean, he's written almost the whole book list. Hi again, you guys. I know this chapter 4 is a long chapter, but we're almost finished. We've got a couple more pages. So thank you for sticking around. The crowd seemed to be made up mostly of witches around Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassed-looking wizard stood at the door, saying, "Calmly, please, ladies. Don't push there. Mind the books now." Harry, Ron, and Hermione squeezed inside. A long queue wound right to the back of the shop where Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of Break with a Banshee and sneaked up the line to where the rest of the Weasleys were standing with Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are," said Mrs. Weasley. She sounded breathless and kept patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at a table surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazzlingly white teeth at the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue, which exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard's hat was set at a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of the way there," he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This is for the Daily Prophet." "Big deal," said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up. He saw Ron, and then he saw Harry. He stared. Then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be Harry Potter!" The crowd parted, whispering excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry's arm, and pulled him to the front. The crowd burst into applause. Harry's face burned as Lockhart shook his hand for the photographer, who was clicking away madly, wafting thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice big smile, Harry," said Lockhart through his own gleaming teeth. "Together, you and I are worth the front page." When he finally let go of Harry's hand, Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to slide back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw an arm around his shoulders and clamped him tightly to his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving for quiet, "what an extraordinary moment this is. The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time. When young Harry here stepped into Flourish and Blots today, he only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present him now, free of charge." The crowd applauded again. "He had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made his glasses slip to the end of his nose, "that he would shortly be getting much, much more than my book, Magical Me. He and his schoolfellows will, in fact, be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart. Staggering slightly under their weight, he managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room where Ginny was standing next to her new cauldron. "You have these," Harry mumbled to her, tipping the books into the cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't even go into a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of me. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he were something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, hey?" "Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for that lot." Ron went as red as Ginny. He dropped his books into the cauldron too and started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George, "what are you doing? It's mad in here. Let's go outside." "Well, well, well, Arthur Weasley." It was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, sneering in just the same way. "Lucius," said Mr. Weasley, coldly. "Busy time at the ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime." He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted from amidst the glossy Lockhart books a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," he said. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. "The company you keep, Weasley. And I thought your family could sink no lower." There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backwards into a bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred or George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stampeded backwards, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please," cried the assistant, and then louder than all, Break it up there, gents. Break it up. Hagrid was wading towards them through the sea of books. In an instant, he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you. Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. You should have ignored him, Arthur, said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. Rotten to the core, the whole family. Everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here. The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, the Grangers shaking with fright and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. A fine example to set to your children, brawling in public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought. He was pleased, said Fred. Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity. But it was a subdued group who headed back to the fireside in the Leaky Cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all their shoppings would be traveling back to the Burrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how bus stops worked, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel. And that is the end of chapter 4. So we will do maybe we'll just do one chapter tomorrow because I'm looking at our time and those chapters were quite long. So it's over an hour today. So I'm thinking if we're doing a read aloud every day, we'll do just like what we would normally do in our class and we'll just do one chapter a day. Okay? I like doing the 2 chapters, but it is quite a long time. And we all have other things that we can be doing too, right? So I think that's what we'll do is one chapter a day. Okay. All right. So any questions about the story or any questions for me, any questions for each other? Now's your time. I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes here, probably about 2 to 3 minutes to have some chats in the comments. I know that I do have some video chats with you guys today and tomorrow. So we can always chat more on there. Okay. You want to see around my house? Maybe not this time. I'll show you here. This is where I've been working. And here I've got a little table here with some plants. And that's all I'll show you today. You guys just get to see my couch in the background. We'll see. Maybe I'll do a little video clip for you guys and I'll give you a tour of my house. We'll see. A house tour, yeah. I'll do a vlog for you. There's not much to show. How will we do the video chat? We can still do the video chat with the other read alouds, Douglas, right? So it'll be the same setup as today. It's just instead of reading 2 chapters, it'll just be 1. Okay. So it'll be a little bit of a shorter video, but you'll get one every day, right? So we'll start again tomorrow. Every day we'll do 1 chapter. Okay. I know, you guys want to see. We'll see. Let me think about it. Okay. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. I got to clean up a little bit. It's messy in here. But if I can get that done this weekend, then maybe on Monday, I'll show you around a little bit. Okay. Any other questions for me or for each other? Oh, right. How many chapters are there? Thank you, Bridget. There are 18 chapters in the second book here. Okay. All right, Mila, we will see you later, my dear. Oh, the one-on-one. So Douglas, I sent out a link, right? So if you have a video chat with me today, I've sent out a link to you guys that you'll have to use to, yeah, bye, Mila, we'll see you later. So I sent out a meeting link. So similar to how we did it before, you'll need to click the link and join the meeting. Okay. And we can test it out and we'll see what happens. Okay. And Dakota, why didn't I use the quirky cup? Well, I figured I would use a different cup because you guys know I have lots of mugs at school, but I have even more here at home. So maybe I'll use a different mug every day. Yes, Douglas, Microsoft Teams. Okay. So that's what we'll be using, and make sure you guys are making sure that you are unmuting yourself so that we can hear each other. Okay. I'm doing pretty well, Dakota. Thank you for asking. I really like doing stuff like this with you guys. It makes it feel a little bit more normal. And I'm really excited to have some more video chats with you guys. That makes me smile too. So I hope you guys are all doing well. And if you have a video chat with me tomorrow, I will be sending out a link to that today. So you'll get an invitation for a chat tomorrow, but I'll send it out this afternoon. Okay. What else? I think that's it. Okay. So I'm going to let you guys go. And I think those of you that I have for chats today, I'm just going to remind you. So Read, yours is coming up at 1 o'clock, right? So let's make sure that we won't forget about that. And I will chat with you guys tomorrow with our other Read Aloud. And then I have lots of other video chats tomorrow too. So I'm going to end it here, and I will chat with you guys later. I hope you have a great day if I don't talk to you later. All right. Bye. Yeah, Dakota, you're right. You're doing yours tomorrow. I've got you on the list. Yeah. All right, you guys, have a great afternoon. We'll chat later. Bye.